What if I told you one of the darkest genocides in history happened in America, and almost no one talks about it? A place you've heard about your whole life, a place associated with opportunity, freedom, and the promise of a better future. But beneath that image, there was something far more disturbing. Because when people rushed west in search of gold, they didn't just bring hope with them. They brought violence, greed, and destruction. Entire Native American communities began to disappear. Villages burned, families torn apart, lives erased. Not in war, but in silence. No massive global headlines, no immediate justice. Just thousands of lives lost, and a story slowly buried over time. History remembers the gold, but it rarely remembers the blood that came with it. But before we start the story, make sure you subscribe to the channel and leave a comment. Which country's dark history do you want to see next? In 1848, everything changed. A single discovery in California triggered one of the biggest migrations in human history: gold. News spread like wildfire. Within months, thousands of people began flooding into California from across America, and then from across the world. They came chasing wealth, opportunity, and a new life. But they weren't entering an empty land. Long before the gold rush began, California was home to hundreds of Native American tribes. These weren't small, scattered groups. They were thriving communities with their own languages, cultures, and ways of life, built over thousands of years. To them, the land wasn't something to own. It was something to live with. But for the newcomers, it was something to take. At first, the encounters were uneasy, but not immediately violent. Some Native Americans traded with settlers. Others tried to avoid them entirely. There was tension, but there was still a chance things could have gone differently. That didn't last. As more settlers arrived, everything began to shift. The demand for land exploded. Rivers were diverted for mining. Forests were cut down. Animals disappeared. Entire ecosystems began to collapse. And with that, Native American survival became harder. Food sources vanished. Water became contaminated. But that was only the beginning, because soon, greed turned into something darker. Settlers didn't just want the land. They wanted the people gone. Violence started slowly. Isolated attacks, small conflicts, moments that could still be dismissed as accidents or misunderstandings. But over time, those moments became a pattern. Villages were raided. People were killed without warning. Entire communities were forced to flee. And the most terrifying part? There were almost no consequences. In fact, in many cases, the violence wasn't just ignored, it was encouraged. Local militias formed, made up of settlers who saw Native Americans not as human beings, but as obstacles. Obstacles to land, obstacles to gold, obstacles to progress. And when you start seeing people as obstacles, it becomes easier to remove them. What began as migration was slowly turning into something far more systematic, something organized, something deadly. Because this wasn't just random violence anymore. It was becoming a system, a way of clearing land by clearing people. And as the gold rush grew bigger, so did the brutality. The world saw California as a land of opportunity, but for Native Americans, it was becoming a land of survival. And soon, even survival would no longer be possible. At first, the violence felt chaotic, uncontrolled, random, like something that might eventually stop. But it didn't. Instead, it evolved. Because what was once scattered attacks slowly became something far more organized, something accepted, something supported. As more settlers poured into California, fear and hatred toward Native Americans grew stronger. Rumors spread, stories were exaggerated. And over time, an idea took hold that Native Americans were not just obstacles, but threats. And once people believe something is a threat, they start justifying anything. Soon, local groups of armed settlers formed militias. They didn't just defend towns, they went out looking for Native Americans, hunting them. Villages were attacked without warning, often at night, when people were asleep and defenseless. Fires spread quickly, panic followed, and by morning, entire communities were gone, men killed. Women and children not spared, survivors forced to run, with nowhere safe to go. But the most disturbing part wasn't just the violence, it was who allowed it to happen. Because this wasn't happening in secret. The government knew, and instead of stopping it, they funded it. Money was given to militias. Supplies were provided. In some cases, people were even paid for their actions. Think about that. Violence was being rewarded. This wasn't just survival anymore. This was a system. A system where killing Native Americans became normalized, where entire communities could be wiped out and nothing would happen. No punishment, no justice. And as time passed, it got worse. Some settlers began capturing Native Americans instead of killing them. Children were taken from families, forced into labor, used as servants. Families were broken apart, not just by death, but by separation. And the land? It was taken piece by piece. Areas that once belonged to tribes for generations were now occupied, mined, and controlled by settlers. Any resistance was met with immediate and overwhelming force. There was no balance, only power. And power was completely one-sided. By the early 1850s, this wasn't just violence anymore. It was something far more deliberate. Entire regions were being cleared of Native Americans. Not by accident, not as a side effect, but intentionally, systematically, because the goal was no longer just gold. The goal was complete control. And for Native Americans, that meant one thing. They were running out of places to go, running out of ways to survive, and most terrifying of all, running out of time. By the mid-1850s, this was no longer just violence. It was erasure. Entire Native American tribes began to disappear not slowly, not over generations, but within years. Places that once echoed with voices, traditions, and life fell completely silent. Villages stood empty, homes burned to the ground, sacred lands taken over, as if no one had ever lived there. But the reality was far worse, because many didn't just vanish, they were hunted. Militias and settlers pushed deeper into native lands, tracking down those who had escaped earlier attacks. There was no safe place left. Forests, rivers, mountains, all became hunting grounds. People were forced to run constantly, day after day, night after night. No food, no shelter, no time to rest. Families were separated in the chaos. Children lost their parents. Parents lost their children. And in many cases, they never found each other again. Survival became the only goal. But even survival came at a cost. Starvation spread quickly. With land taken and animals gone, finding food became nearly impossible. Rivers, once full of life, were now controlled or destroyed by mining. Hunger wasn't temporary. It became constant. And then came disease. Weakened bodies, exhaustion, and poor conditions made it easier for illness to spread. And without any medical help, even small infections turned deadly. People weren't just dying from violence anymore. They were dying from everything around them. And still, it didn't stop. Some Native Americans were captured instead of killed, forced into labor, separated from their identity, their language, their families. Children grew up without knowing who they were. Cultures that had existed for thousands of years began to fade within a single generation. And the outside world? It barely reacted, because this wasn't being seen as a tragedy. It was being seen as progress. Land was being cleared. Resources were being used. Expansion was being achieved. But behind those words were real people, real lives, being erased. By the end of this period, the Native American population in California had dropped drastically. What once was a large, diverse population had been reduced to a fraction of its original size. Not by accident, not by coincidence, but by a combination of violence, forced removal, starvation, disease, and silence. Because silence allowed it to continue. And silence made it easier to forget. But for those who lived through it, there was nothing to forget. Only loss, only survival, and the painful reality that everything they had ever known was gone. By the late 1800s, the violence had done its damage. But the story didn't end there, because what followed was something quieter, something slower, but just as devastating. The Native American population in California had been reduced drastically. Entire tribes were gone. Languages that had existed for centuries were no longer spoken. And those who survived? They were no longer living the lives they once knew, because survival came with a condition: adapt or disappear. Many Native Americans were forced onto small, controlled areas of land. These weren't the lands they had chosen. They weren't rich in resources, and they certainly weren't enough to sustain entire communities. Freedom was gone, movement was restricted, traditions were limited, and slowly, identity began to fade. But the damage wasn't just physical, it was cultural. Because when people are separated from their land, they're also separated from their history. Sacred places were lost. Rituals could no longer be practiced the same way. Knowledge that was once passed down through generations began to disappear. And then came something even more systematic: children. Native American children were taken from their families and placed into institutions where they were forced to abandon their language, their customs, and their identity. They were told to forget who they were, to speak differently, to act differently, to become something else entirely. And over time, many did. Not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. This created a new kind of loss. Not just loss of land, but loss of self. Generations grew up disconnected from their roots. Stories were forgotten, traditions faded, and what remained was only fragments of what once existed. Meanwhile, the land continued to change. Cities grew, industries expanded, and California transformed into something completely different from what it had once been. A place that was once home to diverse native cultures was now built over them. Literally, roads, buildings, and towns stood where villages once existed. People lived their daily lives without ever knowing what had been there before. And that's what made it even more powerful, because the destruction wasn't just about what was lost. It was about how easily it was covered up. No reminders, no acknowledgement, just silence. But silence doesn't erase truth, it only hides it. And for the Native American communities that survived, the past was never truly gone. It lived on in memory, in pain, and in the struggle to hold on to what little remained. Because even after everything, they were still here, still surviving, still carrying the weight of a history that the world had almost forgotten. For a long time, this story stayed buried, not completely erased, but pushed aside, ignored in classrooms, missing from textbooks, rarely spoken about in public. Generations grew up learning about the gold rush, but not about what it cost, because it's easier to celebrate progress than to confront the pain behind it. But truth has a way of coming back. Slowly, quietly, and then all at once. In recent decades, historians, researchers, and Native American communities began bringing these stories back into the light. Old records were re-examined. Hidden documents were uncovered. Survivor accounts once ignored were finally heard. And what they revealed was impossible to deny. This wasn't just a series of unfortunate events. It was organized, it was encouraged, and in many ways, it was enabled. The scale of what happened in California started to become clearer. The number of lives lost, the communities destroyed, the cultures erased. And with that realization came a difficult question. Why didn't we talk about this sooner? Because acknowledging it means confronting something uncomfortable. That this wasn't just the actions of a few individuals, it was part of a system, a mindset. A moment in history where certain lives were seen as less valuable. And that's not easy to face. But for Native American communities, this was never new information. They had always known. These stories were passed down not through textbooks, but through memory, through families, through generations who refused to let the truth disappear completely. And now, the world was finally starting to listen. Efforts began to recognize what happened. Memorials were created. Discussions started. Some institutions even acknowledged the role they played. But recognition doesn't undo the past. It doesn't bring back lost lives. It doesn't restore what was taken. What it does is make sure it isn't forgotten again. Because remembering is a form of justice, and telling the story fully, honestly, without hiding the truth, is the first step toward understanding it. Today, California stands as one of the most powerful and developed places in the world. But beneath that success, there is a history that still echoes, not loudly, not always visibly, but it's there, in the land, in the names, in the stories that are finally being told, because the silence is breaking, and once the truth is heard, it can't be unheard. History isn't just about the past. It's about what we choose to remember and what we choose to forget. For years, the story of what happened in California remained in the shadows, overshadowed by narratives of progress, growth, and success. But now, that silence is breaking. Because the truth can only stay hidden for so long. The reality is simple. What happened wasn't just tragedy. It was a systematic destruction of people, culture, and identity. Lives weren't just lost. They were erased from history. And when something is erased, it creates a dangerous illusion that it never happened at all. But it did. And its effects didn't end in the 1800s. They continued through generations, through communities trying to rebuild what was taken, through individuals trying to reconnect with lost identities, through cultures fighting to survive in a world that almost forgot them. Because survival didn't mean the pain disappeared, it meant carrying it forward. Even today, Native American communities continue to face the consequences of that past loss of land, loss of resources, and the long-term impact of cultural disruption. This isn't just history. It's a reality that still exists. And that's why stories like this matter. Not to assign blame to the present, but to understand the past. Because understanding creates awareness. And awareness creates responsibility. Responsibility to remember. Responsibility to acknowledge. Responsibility to ensure that silence never allows something like this to happen again. Because the most dangerous thing about history is not what happened, it's what we ignore, what we choose not to see, what we allow to fade away. But once a story is told, once the truth is spoken, it becomes part of something bigger, a reminder, a warning, a lesson. California today is seen as a land of opportunity, innovation, and success. But beneath all of that, there is another story, a story of loss, of survival, of voices that refuse to disappear. And maybe that's what history is really about. Not just remembering the victories, but recognizing the cost behind them. Because only when we face the full truth can we truly understand the world we live in today.